Hello, I'm very excited to be participating in this conference and in particular on this panel, as CAPTCHA I think is a pretty good bridge between clickwork and machine learning, which my co-panelists will be discussing. So, just given the limited amount of time I have, I wanted to begin by first outlining what I hope to achieve in this talk. There are going to be three parts, each of which could, maybe should, be more like 10 or 15 minutes apiece, just to give them the detail that they probably require, but we're going to have to make do with 3 or 4 minutes apiece. Hopefully in the Q&A, some more conceptual nuance or historical detail can be brought out, as well as any resonances, of which I think there will be many with the other talks on this panel. So first, I'm going to address aesthetics, what I mean by it, how I intend to utilize it here, as it's kind of the operative word in my talk's title. And I'll ask your forgiveness in advance, as this is going to be a sort of imperfect and hasty explanation of a very complicated topic. Then I'm going to race through a sort of potted history of CAPTCHA with the aim of showing how and why aesthetics can serve as a useful framing device for understanding some of the topics more immediately relevant to this conference, namely technology and labor. And lastly, I'm going to hazard a few insights about how the foregoing aesthetic analysis of CAPTCHA might help us to better understand platform capitalism writ large. So to begin, aesthetics means different things to different people in different contexts at different points in history. But I think we can kind of distill it to aesthetics into two primary approaches that are, of course, interrelated, but I think are also worth pulling apart. So the first associates aesthetics with art, taste, the question of beauty, attention to form, things to do with aesthetic properties. This version has manifested recently in a sort of intriguing online phenomenon where communities and subcultures organize themselves around particular aesthetics. Some of those include cottagecore, which is, my friends tell me, big on TikTok, and labor wave, but also dark academia and light academia. There are also 500 others on this aesthetics wiki that I encourage you to go look into. But along with aesthetic properties, I think there is also a really important intellectual tradition that is interested in aesthetic processes, and this is what I'm interested in here. So the word aesthetics derives from the ancient Greek word aesthesis, which referred to one's lived or felt experience and the knowledge that one obtains through the senses. Aesthesis was used in contrast to eidos, which roughly translates to form and is the root of our word idea. Eidos referred to knowledge through reason. So this version of aesthetics covers things like sense and sensation, the intertwined faculties of perception, interpretation, judgment, as well as more general concepts like embodiment and affect and play. And each of those, I think, have considerable purchase in the humanities today. So all of those ideas of aesthetic process connect directly to the question of aesthetic properties. But by emphasizing process, we also gain access to useful concepts like encounter and relationality and contingency, indeterminacy, etc. And so to this end, I think a good heuristic for understanding aesthetics, at least in the sense that I'm going to use it here, is that it tends to deal with the stuff that is the least amenable to formalization, that which escapes or exceeds categorization and classification. This, of course, includes art, but also just the qualitative richness and unbridled contingency one experiences in everyday life. For this reason, aesthetics has often been taken up by philosophers and theorists as something of an index of humanity, the unique faculty that distinguishes us from animals and machines. And with that said, with the specter of machines now looming, I'm going to turn to CAPTCHA. So before the acronym was hatched, the general premise was independently worked out by a handful of developers in the mid and late 1990s. Since then, CAPTCHAs have become a ubiquitous feature of the online landscape. They regulate, they regulate access to highly coveted consumer goods like concert tickets and streetwear. Supreme went so far as to make a CAPTCHA shirt last year, as well as highly coveted non-consumer goods like recently the COVID vaccine. Hundreds of millions of humans every day utilize their faculties of, perception, interpretation, judgment to solve these annoying little puzzles. And then the CAPTCHA, in effect, interprets our interpretive ability and produces a judgment about us. And so, while the end goal of this aesthetic circuit has remained more or less unchanged since the beginning, which is to differentiate between humans and computers, the means by which this end is achieved has evolved considerably. And I go into this at much greater length in an article I published earlier this year in the journal Internet Histories, but I'm just going to distill some of that argument very quickly here. So the first working prototype was built by a team at the Digital Equipment Corporation and deployed to safeguard their flagship search engine called Alta Vista, which had a kind of growing spam problem. This first iteration generated a random string of characters and warped it using a randomization algorithm. After the users submitted their guess, the CAPTCHA would essentially check for parity with the string it had generated. What's important here, however, is that the CAPTCHA knows the right answer because it produced the right answer in the first place. This, I would argue, resembles something closer to the first aesthetic framework I outlined earlier, one that deals with discrete, classifiable properties. It also kind of resembles something like traditional hermeneutics, where one seeks to pierce through the surface of a text to discover a text's sort of singular or true meaning. But a significant shift occurs around 2007 with the launch of reCAPTCHA. Unlike its predecessor, this version did not know the correct answer in advance and was, accordingly, designed to determine the identity of a user by other means. Rather, the correct answer was simply whatever other humans had also submitted. reCAPTCHA, in effect, convened multiple internet users unbeknownst to one another to produce a social consensus. This is a markedly different value proposition than its predecessor, where the original CAPTCHAs judged humanness based on the user's ability to produce a predetermined truth value. reCAPTCHA was designed to provoke and capture instances of contingency. It is this pivot towards something that we might see to be more processual or relational that I want to argue makes aesthetics a useful tool for political and economic analysis here. So this shift towards consensus and contingency, which again I'm arguing is one with distinctly aesthetic implications, even if that's not how the reCAPTCHA developers would have discussed it, is essentially what enabled reCAPTCHA to become a mechanism for crowdsourcing clickwork from unwitting internet users. It allowed Google, which acquired reCAPTCHA in 2009, to capture little bits of human intellect with unprecedented granularity, and at sufficient scale, this would ultimately serve to significantly bolster many of the company's flagship offerings. As is pretty well known by now, reCAPTCHA was central to the enormous digitization efforts undertaken by Google Books. reCAPTCHA also helped to digitize the entire archive of the New York Times, which was a client of Google's at the time. And then if we skip ahead a few steps, this is also what's happening with those infamous stop signs and streetlights, which according to this very viral tweet from a few weeks ago, seems to be especially irksome to people. In this iteration, each solved reCAPTCHA is repurposed as a bit of annotated data for Google's contemporary machine learning systems. And so finally, this gets us to platforms. I'm not really interested in litigating whether reCAPTCHA itself is worth describing as a platform, although I think a case could probably be made, because platforms have proven to be somewhat nebulous conceptually. There's been considerable debate over what constitutes a platform, whether all platforms work the same way, etc. Nick Cernicek's book offers a taxonomy of contemporary platforms. There are cloud platforms, advertising platforms, product platforms, etc. Other scholars like Raman Sabeel and Kathleen Talon have traced the unique socio-political conditions that gave rise to the platform model. And Martin Kenny and John Zeisman have suggested that the platform model is designed specifically to skirt regulatory frameworks, which they describe as a form of arbitrage between corporate practice and existing legislative policy. I think arbitrage is actually a good way of framing platforms, and one that Cernicek and Sabeel and Talon would probably agree with. However, I would like to reframe the issue slightly by suggesting that another thing central to platformization is something that we might sort of clunkily, but I think maybe usefully, call aesthetic arbitrage. And what I mean by this is that platforms are where the incommensurable faculties of human interpretation and digital information processing converge. To this end, platforms produce value by enlisting the aesthetic faculties of users or workers as a stopgap for that which they cannot automate. For example, when a delivery courier effortlessly weaves through a bustling intersection, or a social media content moderator determines where exactly the line should be drawn between harmful speech and ironic speech, both workers, I would argue, are performing complicated tasks of perception, interpretation, and judgment, tasks that, for one reason or another, have proven impossible or infeasible to automate. So I think that aesthetic theory, and in particular one focused on processes, not just properties, can help us to better understand the nature of platform work. And I think this is maybe a bit more of a stretch, but I think this is how it works within the context of my research. Each individual CAPTCHA encounter can be understood as a social and technical microcosm of how value is captured and capitalized by platforms, in this case like Uber Eats and Facebook, although I think this extends to others as well. So just to conclude, I want to emphasize that this insight about aesthetics and value production has quite deep roots. At many junctures of intellectual history, aesthetics has been denigrated as secondary to the so-called first philosophies of epistemology and ontology. This marginalization of sensorial and embodied ways of knowing has political economic implications. Many historians of science and technology have documented this phenomenon. Notably, Pamela H. Smith's account of artisanal knowledge production in early modern art, and Matthew Jones' his history of calculators, which underscores just how much highly esteemed philosopher inventors like Leibniz and Babbage actually relied on the unheralded contributions of their artisans. In both of these historical examples, the authors note that the work of the artisans, which again I would argue is predicated on deeply aesthetic sensibilities, and I think that is present in both books if you read them, the work of the artisans had been thoroughly undervalued and overlooked precisely because those in power had deemed the work to be merely, quote, mechanical, and the workers to be indistinguishable from, quote, automata. So this feat of dehumanization points to a central irony, one that I think holds considerable purchase for understanding contemporary capitalism. Our aesthetic faculties seem to be both uniquely valuable and uniquely vulnerable to devalorization. So, to really conclude, we can consider a 2015 lawsuit where a Massachusetts woman sued Google, alleging unpaid wages associated with the work of solving reCAPTCHAs. The judge's decision, which was almost 9,000 words long, is a rich text for analysis, in as much as it raises significant questions about labor, software, the relationship between the two. But ultimately, and perhaps unsurprisingly, given what we know about the value often attributed to aesthetic intelligence, the judge ruled in Google's favor. The last line of the decision, where the winner was declared, reads, quote, "Judgment shall be entered in Google's favor." As a closing provocation, I would just suggest that it might be productive to read this bit of legalese quite literally, meaning that we understand platforms like Google and others, purpose-built for the automated capture of data, as aesthetic engines, fueled by the aesthetic faculties of humans, including but not limited to judgment. Thank you very much.